Hi, Anatol.
Hello.
How you doing?
Fine. Nice to see you.
Good to see you again. It's been a while. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Anatol Lieven. You've been a professor at various places. Right now, you are at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington. I mean, you're not physically there, but that's your big affiliation now. You're a senior research fellow on Russia and Europe, author of a number of books, most recently Climate Change and the Nation State. That's not what we're going to talk about, maybe down the road, but you're also the author of an earlier book called Ukraine and Russia, Fraternal Rivalry. That's closer to what we're going to be talking about, which is the Ukraine crisis, which most people are probably familiar with. There are Russian troops along the Ukrainian border. Vladimir Putin has called for some things that strike some people as an ultimatum, notably including some kind of guarantee that Ukraine will not ever join NATO. The list is longer than that, but that seems to be at the top. And I wanted to talk to you about this whole thing because you know a lot about the region. I hope we'll have time toward the end to ask you a question that I hope will have a hopeful answer, which is it possible this could lead to something good in the ultimately, in other words, a larger diplomatic conversation that addresses a number of the kind of structural security problems involving the US, Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and so on. So I'm going to carve out time for that. You might, if you want to give us a sneak preview, you could give us a yes or no answer. Do you think there's any hope on that front?
Hope dies last, as the Russians say. I hope so. But I mean, obviously, given the history of the West's relations with Russia over the past 30 years, one can't be too optimistic.
Okay. Let's start with your assessment of the situation relative to the standard way it's being described. I mean, I just gave you the standard description, I guess. There's people say 100,000 troops. He's clearly making logistical preparations that would be associated with some kind of invasion. The list of demands goes beyond the Ukraine-NATO issue to include, I think, even pulling some existing members of NATO out of NATO. Of course, NATO has expanded relentlessly toward Russia since the Cold War. That was a critical decision made by the US in particular, for reasons that probably don't make sense to either you or me. But here we are. NATO has absorbed not just former members of the Warsaw Pact, the Russia's equivalent of NATO during the Cold War, but but former republics of the Soviet Union. NATO is now on Russia's border, and Putin has said not to like this. Do you share the degree of alarm and the sense of peril that we're hearing? I mean, in other words, do you think we are likely to see an invasion, given the fact that not nearly all of Putin's demands are going to be met?
It's possible, but I don't regard this as a 1914 style ultimatum, because if it had been, then obviously Russia would have moved by now. The negotiations are still ongoing. And there have been some indications of flexibility. Also, before they could launch a full-scale invasion, or even, I think, a more limited incursion to take the whole of the Donbass, the Russians would need to assemble more troops. We would see this coming. We'd have some warning, at least. 100,000 is not enough for that. So far, this is Russian pressure. But I am afraid that the Russian government has pitched its demands so high that it will be very difficult now for Putin to withdraw from this without, some success or appearance of success. So, I mean, what US negotiators ought to be doing, it is, finding a way, building a golden bridge, if you will, to allow the Russians to withdraw from their maximal demands without humiliation.
Mhm.
This is the essence of diplomacy. But it does require flexibility. It also requires, not tying the hands of the Biden administration. If the U.S. Congress had tied the hands of the Kennedy administration in the way that they're trying to do with Biden during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there is a very, very good chance that none of us will be alive today.
Is Congress actually trying to do formal things now to tie Biden's hands?
Well, in effect, yes, with the sanctions bill, which mandates greatly intensified sanctions for even a limited Russian action. Fortunately, Ted Cruz's bill was defeated, but the Menendez bill is not, much better.
Okay. And when you say Putin needs to save face, do you mean both in front of the international community and in front of his domestic political audience?
Yes, because something that is not nearly enough recognized in the West is that there are people within the Russian establishment who are much harder line than Putin. And ever since 2014, the Ukrainian revolution and Russia's response have been bitterly unhappy that Russia didn't go much further in that year. Remember, Russia annexed Crimea and, it backed a rebellion in part of eastern Ukraine. But militarily speaking, there was nothing to stop Russia from taking much bigger areas. And, the massacre of Russian protesters in Odessa would have given them a pretty good excuse for intervention. And there's a line in the Russian establishment that Putin didn't do that because he placed too much faith in the Germans, in particular, and French, to negotiate a compromise, which, of course, they've wholly failed to do.
Now, it's funny. I think of Putin as being responsive to domestic politics in the sense that he wants to maintain broad popular support. And I think that's an underappreciated fact about people we call dictators. They actually do not have unlimited power. They very much care about how they are perceived by the people in their country. I hadn't thought of him as being susceptible to pressure from other elites so much. But your reading is because I had just thought of him as controlling all the levers in that realm. But your view, I mean, what kinds of people does he need to worry about at the higher echelons of Russian power? You mean oligarchs or people in government or both or what?
State oligarchs, the kind of ex-Secret Service people, who he has put in charge of large swathes of the private economy. And the oil, gas, and mineral sector, because Putin. I mean, once again, people get the nature of the Russian system wrong. Putin is as much the chairman of a quarreling board of Russian elites as he is a personal dictator, and all of these people have a great share of power themselves. And they're, behind the scene. Now, none of this comes out in public, of course, but behind the scenes, they do have a great deal of power. And of course, the other thing to remember is that, if as Putin gets older, at some stage, he is going to want to retire. And at that point, the whole, these divisions could burst out into the open again. So he has to. He has to maintain his grip on the Russian establishment.
So he can't just fire, like if one of these guys gets unruly, he can't just fire him without paying some big price?
1, yes. 5, no.
I see. So in other words, if 3 or 4 of them say, look, you're not being tough enough on Ukraine, then he has a problem.
Yeah. And I mean, basically what they're saying to him is, look, we told you so. We told you should have gone much further in 2014. You told us, no, it's more important to work with France and Germany and the Europeans. And, I have a good relationship with Merkel. We will work something out. And they now said, we told you so.
And what do they wish had happened? What are they blaming him for not having happened? What had they hoped Ukraine would look like now? I mean, after all, he did successfully seize Crimea, they've annexed it. They're not giving it back. That's where the big Russian naval base is. That's an important thing from their point of view to hold on to. The Donbass, which is the easternmost, I guess, most intensively Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, is beyond the control of Kiev. At the time, people had said, during the first part of this crisis after the 2014 revolution, people said, well, what Putin wants is just to keep the civil war on simmer and keep Ukraine from being an effective state. The civil war is on simmer. I don't know how effective Ukraine is. What do you think these people in his circle of power are blaming him for right now? What do they want to happen?
But the thing is that there is this line in the West that, Putin just, wants to create wars. Putin, likes disruption, et cetera, et cetera. That is, frankly, hate-filled garbage. It's rubbish. The Russian establishment, not just Putin, has concrete goals. It will use ruthless methods to try to achieve those goals. They don't necessarily work, but in Ukraine, the point is to keep Ukraine as a whole out of a Western alliance, a de facto alliance, not just a membership of NATO, and to preserve the Russian and Russian-speaking populations within Ukraine as a really powerful force to ensure friendly relations with Russia. Now, for that, of course, the annexation of Crimea was important in itself. Occupying 2/3 of the Donbass does not hack it. What they would have wanted was basically to take half of Ukraine, all the Russian-speaking areas, and then not annex them, but turn them into autonomous republics, and then say, oh no, we want a united, sovereign Ukraine. Absolutely, we are deeply committed to Ukrainian national unity on these conditions, which would be neutrality or no membership of NATO, plus autonomy, federalization for Ukraine as a whole, with guarantees for the Russian language, and therefore for friendship with Russia, through basically all the Russian-speaking areas having local autonomy and control over their own. So that's what the look. I mean, there are mad Russians who would like to annex Ukraine as a whole, but they're not in the establishment. The establishment has a more limited series of goals, which they haven't got yet. Now, the question is, how little can Putin accept now in terms of a deal? Can't accept nothing, that's for sure.
Yeah. And is there concern with Ukraine? Of course, in America, we're like, what's the problem? Don't you understand? We have innocent intentions and we would never want to invade Russia or anything. Meanwhile, of course, we think that we need a buffer that's at least as big as the entire Western Hemisphere. I mean, literally, that's a formal doctrine, but we don't understand why anybody could find us threatening. Is the concern within Putin's circle that this is actually a national security issue? If Ukraine is not there as a buffer state, Russia could get invaded, or is it more like they need a Ukraine sympathetic to Russian interests in order to get various, favorable treatment in various realms that are not existential?
I mean, the Russians are just as paranoid as the Americans, if you see what I mean. Mexico entering an alliance with China would not threaten the actual invasion of the United States. But you know as well as I do, it would send the entire American security establishment into a state of total hysteria. Nothing else would matter in American politics until that had been reversed. And America would use whatever methods were necessary, as it always has, in order to destroy the Mexican government responsible for that and replace it with one sympathetic to the United States. So that's the first thing. Russia has a blob just as America has a blob, and blobs operate according to permanent doctrines. which lay down what the blob considers to be the vital interests of the states concerned. And if you do not sign,
blob meaning, for those who don't follow these things, the American foreign policy establishment, people like you and I use it in a not entirely flattering way. That term. Go ahead.
And if you don't sign up to these doctrines, at least formally and in public, you're not a member of the blob, as I no doubt we have both experienced. If you don't sign up to universal American primacy in the world, you are not a member of the blob in America. If you don't sign up to Russia retaining predominant influence in its immediate neighborhood and excluding hostile military alliances, you're not a member of the Russian blob. I mean, they won't shoot you, but they also will not, invite you to be a senior position, to have any position in the Russian administration. But with Ukraine, you see, here's something where it's more difficult for America to understand. But there is also the factor of concern for the Russian minority in Ukraine and its status, and for the whole historical, cultural, ethnic relationship between Russia and Ukraine. This, by the way, makes Ukraine a very different case from the Baltic states, let alone Poland or Czechoslovakia, whatever. The thing is that, as seen from Russia, Putin said this, in an essay in last summer, but widely shared in the Russian establishment. What is happening now in Ukraine is there is developing a Ukrainian ethnic nationalism backed by the West, which is dedicated, which is shaping itself around hostility to Russia, and plans to destroy the Russian language. And
in fact, there are initiatives now. I gather that the Russian language is to some extent being pushed out of schools, out of media. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but things along those lines are happening from Kiev, right?
Yes, and from Russian perspective, this is just what the Latvians and Estonians did after independence, under the cover of NATO and EU membership. So, and Russia is determined to stop that. Now, it has to be said, of course, that a lot of what Russia itself has done since 2014, has done an enormous amount to stimulate this Ukrainian hostility,
like supporting the rebels in Donbass.
Yeah, exactly, and generally, Russia's and the annexation of Crimea and Russian pressure. But in any case, that's what this is about from a Russian point of view.
And that, I mean, again, so-called autocrats do have to worry about political rivals. That's why Navalny is in jail, because Putin's worried. That's why people sometimes get disappear or get killed, I guess. But and you can imagine this being a very strong card for a political rival to play. If you can say our brother Russians are being oppressed in Ukraine, and arguably you could point to examples right now where they're suddenly finding it harder to find like Russian language media outlets because of things being done in Kiev. That's a very powerful political card for a rival to play. In fact, I had heard that Navalny himself is more of a nationalist than Americans realize. They assume Navalny is some kind of cosmopolitan, sophisticate made in their image, but actually. He himself might not be above saying something like that. I don't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi, we cultivated an image of her which turned out to be very largely mistaken. Navalny is, if anything, more of an ethnic nationalist than Putin himself. And I don't believe that there is the slightest chance that Navalny, if in some parallel universe he became president, he certainly would not hand back Crimea and the Donbass, and he would regard it as his duty to defend the position of Russia and Russians within Ukraine. This, you see, I mean, the whole point is this is not, we go on and on and on and on about Putin, or rather not about Putin, but about a kind of mythological monster called Putin. Putin this, Putin that is aimed about Putin. Or Putin. It's about the sense of vital Russian interests held by the Russian establishment, and by very large numbers of ordinary Russians as well.
Yeah. So what do you think is the, well, I guess there are two questions. Is there something that Biden could do, given the political constraints he faces, or at least thinks he faces? And just parenthetically, I would say, I think one thing that Donald Trump showed is that actually the American people don't necessarily have the same concerns about foreign policy that the foreign policy establishment has. He showed you can actually heap disrespect on John McCain and get elected president, something previously thought impossible. Okay. So Biden may actually have, when it comes to popular opinion, a little more running room than he thinks he does. But that with that question bracketed off, I'd like to address two questions. One is, what do you think the most we can hope for Biden to do by the way of concessions that might head off any military action? And then we'll get to the question of, failing that, what's the minimum military action you think Putin needs in order to shore up, address his own political issues?
Well, I mean, I still hope that the American team could do three things, none of which sacrifice anything from a Western point of view. The first is, now it's been made clear that we can't permanently rule out NATO membership for Ukraine. But given that absolutely nobody, and I mean nobody, thinks that Ukraine can be a member of NATO within the next 10 or 20 years, what would be possible would be to declare a moratorium, to say, look, since you take this so seriously, and since, Ukrainian membership is not a imminent thing in any case, we will say that we will only reconsider this, if we reconsider it at all, say 10, the Russians might demand 20, we offer 10, maybe we compromise on 15, that.
So that's a moratorium on any NATO expansion or on Ukrainian. I mean, it might be politically easier to phrase it generically and say.
Yeah, you're quite right. No, any further NATO expansions, that's the first thing. The second thing is, the United States remains formally committed to the Minsk II peace settlement idea for the Donbass, which is autonomy within Ukraine, demilitarized under international guarantees. Now, the Ukrainians have been refusing to guarantee permanent autonomy for the Donbass. Mm-hmm. And America has brought no pressure to bear on them, and the French and Germans have sat still. A strong, then we would have to see whether it was possible to get the Ukrainians to agree with it. But a very strong US, NATO, and EU statement of continued commitment to the Minsk II process, with a specific, commitment to full autonomy under international guarantees. That would be a second thing, which would only be actually a reiteration of existing US formal policy, but it would obviously give the appearance of a success to Moscow. We could also accompany that with a statement of belief that Ukraine must develop as a multi-ethnic democracy involving full linguistic and cultural rights for the Russian minority within Ukraine. That is entirely in keeping with Western principles, and we could say specifically that, which is quite true, that the linguistic rights of the minority, respect for that, is a condition of eventual membership of NATO and the European Union. So that would also give the Russians the appearance of a success. And finally, when it comes to the withdrawal of troops, well, of course, there's an obvious solution there. Because once again, obviously NATO can't accept unilateral withdrawals, but it should be possible to work out an agreement whereby, of course, Russia must withdraw its troops from the Ukrainian border and end the threat of invasion. And in return, NATO will promise, will remove some of its existing troops from close to Russia's borders, and will.
You mean in what kinds of places? I mean, they're not in Ukraine, right?
No, Baltic states, Poland, Romania. But we'll also undertake that as long as Russia does not, once again, deploy troops to threaten Ukraine, NATO will not deploy additional troops close to Russia's borders. So all of those things would not involve. They would be reciprocal. They would not involve surrender on the part of the West. And I think, and of course guarantee it, that would give the Russian government enough of a success to allow them to back down. Now, when it comes to the possibility of a wider relationship, there was a very good piece by Tom Graham, the former American number 2 in Moscow. We're having a debate at the Quincy Institute with him and Fyodor Lukyanov of the Russian Council on Foreign Relations on Thursday. And Tom said that, ideally what one should have is a new European architecture involving Russia, which would then set out to solve all the existing territorial disputes and unrecognized territories in Europe, including Kosovo, of course, on the only basis that they can possibly be solved, which is a will of the majority of the local population. In other words, you have referenda in Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, the Donbass, Crimea, and Kosovo, on do they want to go back to to rejoin their previous states, and does Kosovo want to rejoin Serbia? I think we can be pretty sure of what the majority there would say. But there would then be also the possibility of bits of those territories then choosing to stay, with Europe. So Mitrovica, the Serbian-speaking bit, the last bit of Kosovo, could stay with Serbia. Gali, the remaining Georgian-populated bit of Abkhazia, could vote to go back to Georgia. And you would basically have a solution of all these conflicts on common democratic principles, but reciprocal.
Right. So we would acknowledge the legitimacy of Russian-speaking separatists in Georgia. They would acknowledge the separatist aspirations of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo, because this is one of their grievances with us. We intervened in Serbia in '99 or something on behalf of the Kosovo, and so that would all get worked out. So that's an answer to the question I had asked at the open. These are the kinds of issues that a larger and just to finish that thought, in Georgia, Russia intervened on behalf of these separatists within Georgia. I think partly as payback for Kosovo, partly by way of protesting our saying in 2008 that we expect both Ukraine and Georgia to eventually join NATO. Both of those are, of course, former Soviet republics.
Yeah, but actually, no, Russia didn't. Those conflicts date back to the last years of the Soviet Union. Russia inherited those conflicts from the Soviet Union. And by the way, I mean...
Okay, but it did, just to make sure I've got this right, there was, in 2008, a conflict in Georgia known as the Georgia-Russia War. Russia was intervening on behalf of separatists within Georgia, right?
Not exactly. Russian troops were in South Ossetia as peacekeepers, replacing the Soviet troops who'd been there.
I see.
Before. Russia had not recognized the independence of South Ossetia. It said we still recognize it as part of Georgia, but we want a peace settlement which will guarantee full autonomy for these areas within Georgia, which the Georgians refused to consider. And then the Georgians attacked in August 2008. The Georgians attacked South Ossetia. Okay,
so there were Russian troops there.
Exactly.
Russia ultimately sent more troops into Georgia during this, but I take your point. Okay. So,
by the way, if I can just finish the thought.
Yeah.
I mean, the other point about a solution along these lines is that it would be based on reality. Kosovo is not going back to Serbia unless there is a new war, which Serbia wins, which, could happen at some stage, but not obviously as long as NATO backs Kosovo. Crimea is not going back to Ukraine since Russia has formally annexed it, unless, of course, we are prepared to send an army of 500,000 men to Ukraine to attack Russia and drive them out of Crimea. A war we might very well lose, and which would also, of course, involve a pretty high chance of nuclear war. Are we prepared to do that? No. So at that point, why not recognize reality? But of course, as I say, it has to be mutual recognition of reality. The Russians have to recognize, the independence of Kosovo.
And Crimea is a bitter pill to swallow in the sense of it being a change of borders that was accomplished by force. You could, in a way, you could maybe say that for some of these other things. But anyway, that's an issue that would.
Well, if I can just say something on that score, I don't think that we found that pill too hard to swallow, have we? We swallowed it
not when we changed it. No, not when we intervened. We invade illegally all the time. I agree.
But not just us, but some of our allies as well. When the Turks invaded Cyprus, did we kick them out of NATO? No. Did we impose economic sanctions? No, we did not. Israel don't even let's go there. When America has in effect carved out de facto independence for the Kurds of Iraq after invading. Now there may be a perfectly good case for this, but please, don't let us pretend that we have been in any way consistent about this, or that there aren't, perfectly good international precedents for once you're in this mess. And of course, it would be much better if you went in this mess to start with, for recognizing reality. That, by the way, is what we've also done, in the case of Southern Sudan. For example, America backed independence for Southern Sudan and eventually recognized Southern Sudanese independence. No,
you don't have to. You don't have to convince me of the hypocrisy charge. So that's you've listed some things to get back to the earlier. Just because you've listed some things that you think maybe the West, the US, NATO could do. I'm not sure how easy it would be for Biden to do all of those things politically. So before we move to the question of what you think, barring those kinds of concessions, the minimum Putin has to do militarily, a question that occurred to me is what if somebody other than Biden made the concessions and somebody other than America? In other words, NATO, I think, strictly speaking, can only do things through unanimous consent. So in principle, Hungary could guarantee Russia, right? That which it might be inclined to do. But more, perhaps more, a better example would be if you got some more mainstream NATO member like Germany, or anyway, some country to say, we guarantee you that we will not be supporting membership for Ukraine in NATO until blah, blah, blah. It seems, I wondered ever. I wondered if that is, does that seem conceivable to take the political heat off of Biden?
Well, it's conceivable. I wrote an article advocating just this, saying that Macron could end this crisis if Macron were to go. But that is perhaps rather a lot to ask. But certainly, if the French came out and said, look, we do not believe that Ukraine either can or should ever be in NATO, and I will veto NATO membership for Ukraine, and I expect my successors to do the same. In my view, that would end the immediate crisis, partly, of course, because at that point, the Russians could sit back and watch, the NATO countries tearing each other's hair out and sort of mud wrestling, and while the Russians drank a cup of coffee. So I think that would end the crisis. By the way, it would also, of course, once again, recognize reality. And let's just come back to reality for a second as far as taking Ukraine into NATO is concerned. That implies a readiness to defend Ukraine against a possible Russian attack. Now, that means the dispatch to Ukraine of an American army on the scale of the American army in West Germany during the Cold War. We are talking here about a couple of 100,000 men, at least, and a large part of the US Air Force. You are also talking, by the way, about something we have not had for the previous 30 years, basically now, which is serious armed forces in Western Europe. You're talking about the Germans actually, creating serious armed forces, which they don't have. You are talking about the British essentially doubling their military expenditure, because on top of their ridiculous aircraft carriers, they would have to rebuild the army. At present, Britain has 2 brigades. The entire British army can mobilize 2 brigades for action. I mean, to do more, it has to call up the, Dad's army, the territorials, and pull tanks out of mothballs that have been sitting in garages for 20 years, at which point they fall to pieces. 2 brigades. 2 brigades can't defend Ukraine. But my point is, nobody is thinking about this. And if you go to the Pentagon and say, right, we are committed to Ukrainian membership of NATO, this is what we have to do, they're going to say, you must be mad. Have you forgotten about China? You're proposing to send most of the American Air Force back to Europe. That would be a green light for China to take Taiwan. What are you thinking of? Well, I'll tell you what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking that we might actually, bring together the 2 parts of our brain and put our mouths where our actual military, reality and deployments are. Because the degree of, dysfunction or cognitive dissonance by now in the West over this is approaches the surreal, frankly.
Yeah.
So, as does, by the way, which I have to say with due shame as a European or a semi-detached European, the idea that our gallant European allies will ever fight for anything. They won't.
Okay. So if we assume that your list of kind of concessions that might appease Russia does not materialize, is not put forward by the West, which seems to me as a matter of political reality likely that we won't see that set of concessions forthcoming. What do you think is the minimum that Putin, given the pressures he sees as impinging on him and his own aspirations, political and geopolitical, what do you think the minimum military response is that we will see from him?
I think if the Russians get nothing that they can present as a success, then what they might do initially is take the whole of the Donbass. And maybe not with an open Russian incursion, but I mean, it would be, but it wouldn't be called that. It would be called, reinforcements would go to the separatists, and they would then drive the Ukrainians out of the whole of the Donbass.
Now, that is 2 provinces or republicans, whatever, Donetsk and one other one. Is that right?
Lugansk, yes. But they're only about 2/3 of them are presently held by the separatists.
Okay.
So that might be the first step. And then, there would be an element of deniability. Nobody would really believe the Russians weren't involved, but there would be a sort of legal let out. And then you could see that, and then the Russians would stop and say, okay, look, we've made our point. We will fight. You will not fight. Let's talk again, right? Now, are you prepared to listen and give us, some?
But this would involve obvious actual participation by Russian forces, artillery, missiles, and so on. I mean, you don't think they can plausibly? I don't even think they want to plausibly claim, right? I mean, for political reasons, Putin wants to say, "Yeah, we did this," right?
Well, I was on both sides of the Abkhaz War in 92 to 93. After the Georgians, by the way, invaded Abkhazia, they also started that war.
Yeah.
People have totally forgotten the real history of many of these conflicts.
Right.
But anyway, that war was won in the end by the Abkhaz with the help of an amazing bunch of different volunteer groups. But it was also won with the help of a Russian tank unit. And I visited that tank unit. It wasn't hard to visit. It was sort of sitting there in its tanks. And so I went up to them, and they had very hastily painted Abkhaz flags on those tanks, and I had my Abkhaz interpreter with me, who, by way of a little bit of an unkind joke, attempted to speak to the Russian tank crews in Abkhaz, which they looked very, very bewildered at. You could see where the Russian, flags and markings had been painted over. But amusingly, it was rather like, these fake, fake, what are they called, accessories, where they put the badges on, the what are they called, you know what I mean, the Fendi or Gucci markers on.
Oh yeah, the counterfeit brands you buy in, the knockoff watches you buy in, yeah.
Well, quite a lot of these Abkhaz flags had been attached upside down to the Russian tanks. So this was, to put it mildly, a pretty thin pretense of non-involvement. But
which would be good for Putin politically. I mean, what he would like is for it to be not plausible deniability. Actually, in other words, American politicians saying these are Russians, and he could go to his people and say, kind of nod, yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, everyone would know. But the point is that there would be just, enough room, diplomatic wiggle room. But the point is, though, that if at that point the West still not only refused to negotiate, but imposed maximal sanctions, then I think Russia would have nothing to lose. And then there would be a real possibility of Russia going much further and taking much, much bigger areas.
What's the most...
The other point there, of course, is that in this battle in the Donbass, the Russians would also be able to assess just how hard the Ukrainians fought. Because if the Russians thought that they were going to face a really big, hard fight in Ukraine, and that this might involve, the Ukrainians holding out in cities and the cities being destroyed in the process, then I think that would really give Russia pause. But if they won very easily in the Donbass, and if the West then refused to negotiate and impose sanctions, then I think they would basically, or could, move on to take most of the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine.
Okay, so you're saying minimum we could expect would be taking all of those two republics that constitute the Donbass, which, if you look at a map of Ukraine, doesn't seem like all that much. It doesn't even encompass all of the Ukrainian-Russian border. There's also been discussion of securing a land bridge between Crimea and those regions, which would mean there would then be a land bridge between Crimea and Russia proper. What do you think is the most we should worry about? What's the most? I mean, nobody seems to think Russia is going to try to occupy Kiev. I've heard some people say it might, to make a point, actually bomb some military installations on the Kiev side of Ukraine. But what do you think in the near term, as part of the initial incursion, after which there would be some kind of pause and perhaps discussion? What do you think is the most that incursion could constitute?
Well, the very most, in territorial terms, is that the Russians cross the Dnieper River and march all the way.
Now, is that right where Kiev kind of is, or is that there's a big waterway right where Kiev is? Is that shy of that, or what?
Well, but the Dnieper sort of has a curious bend in it. The Russians would know. I think the Russians would never march to Kiev. No, but if they cross the lower Dnieper down by the Black Sea, they might feel they had to do that because there is another pro-Russian separatist area called Transnistria, which is part of what is now the independent Republic of Moldova. Although a bit like Crimea, it was never historically part of Moldova. It was another of these areas that was, shifted around under Stalin and Khrushchev. Now, the point is that has also been holding out as a separatist area with a Russian garrison. And of course, if the Ukrainians blockade that, then Russia cannot reinforce it or feed it. And so the Russians might feel that to eliminate that possibility, they have to go all the way. Well, that means occupying Odessa and the whole Black Sea coast of Ukraine. So then they basically take half the country. They won't go to Kiev on land. They won't invade Western Ukraine. But what you were saying, I mean, look, if you have a full-scale war of that kind, then of course the Russian Air Force missile forces will set out to destroy the Ukrainian Air Force as far as possible on the ground. So you will certainly see not bombardment of cities, I believe, because the Russians will be deeply anxious to avoid civilian casualties. But you will certainly see the bombardment of airfields across the whole of Ukraine to knock out the Ukrainian Air Force. Look, at this point, we would be talking about a blitzkrieg, an attempt at a blitzkrieg with everything that goes with that.
At which point, there's in the maximalist vision you've laid out, you start to see more political pressure in the West, certainly in the United States, for actual intervention on behalf of the United States. I doubt that would be decisive, but you just never know.
I mean, one possibility at that point. Sorry, I'm becoming so cynical. You understand on these things.
Can't imagine why.
No, is that once it became absolutely clear that Russia was not going to march as far as Kiev or into central and western Ukraine, the United States and possibly even NATO members would send 2 or 3 men heroically to defend a line that the Russians had no intention of attacking anyway. And NATO would parade up and down, trumpeting its courage and resolve and heroism, while the Russians carefully stayed 100 miles or so to the east. That would be NATO's golden bridge. It would enable NATO to look wonderful, at least to itself. How much anyone else in the world would be convinced, I don't know. But I mean, I've always felt that for many years now, NATO is basically a self-admiration society.
Yeah, and of course that assumes Russia wouldn't feel compelled for political reasons or whatever to bomb more other stuff while not confronting, any NATO presence directly to keep kind of needling. You can imagine this getting out of hand. Okay, so I know you, I know you need to go in like 3 minutes. At this point, do you think some sort of conflict, some sort of incursion is more likely than not, given what it would take to forestall one and the political reasons not to expect that?
On balance, yeah, I would say, we're looking at 6-4 or so, maybe. But I still do believe that a peaceful solution is possible, and actually, in terms of real Western interests and US interests, as opposed to the what you've talked about, the domestic political pressures on Biden. I still think that a political compromise ought to be entirely possible without sacrificing any actual, not just any important Western positions, but actually any significant Western positions at all, given the realities on the ground.
Okay. So I want you to, in closing, tell people what pieces of yours they should read on this. Before that, I'm going to engage in some, I guess, not entirely uncharacteristic self-promotion. Say, I just posted a piece in my newsletter, the Nonzero newsletter last night, that provides the historical background. And it's an argument that ever since the late 90s, when we started to expand NATO, if we had paid more attention to how all of this was looking from Russia's perspective, we just would not have done a series of things, certainly including the relentless expansion of NATO, but not confined to it, a series of things that weren't particularly in our interest anyway, in America's interest, and would predictably antagonize Russia. So there's this I hope reasonably concise piece of historical background. I think it's called How Cognitive Empathy Could Have Averted the Ukraine Crisis. But in any event, it's the piece at the top.
I strongly recommend that as well. I've just been reading.
Well, thank you, Anatol, and I strongly recommend whatever you're about to plug and your entire oeuvre. For example, we've known each other for decades, actually, and I've always been impressed by the clarity of your vision. What should people read?
Well, if they want to see how I've always been right, which, I don't know how widespread
I can attest to your 100% accuracy record.
Well, they could go back and look, what I wrote in 1995 for the Atlantic Monthly, amongst other places, warning of where all this would lead. And in my book on Ukraine and Russia, A Fraternal Rivalry, that came out in 1999, I warned. By the way, I also warned the Russians. I said an attempt, as, by the way, Putin did in 2013, which was a terrible mistake, to bring Ukraine into a full-scale Russian alliance will cause a revolution in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. But similarly, an attempt to bring Ukraine into a full-scale Western alliance will cause a rebellion in parts of Ukraine supported by Russia, which, of course, is exactly what's happened. Now, anyone who's sufficiently interested can read what I've been writing for Responsible Statecraft, the Quincy journal. I have a piece coming out this week in Time. But also, if you're really interested, I wrote a long paper for the Quincy last summer, which has just been updated and reissued, setting out in detail the formula for a peace settlement of the Donbass crisis. So, yeah.
Okay, so people Google your name and Responsible Statecraft and or Quincy, they could throw that word in and they'll get there. What's your Twitter handle?
It's Anatol. God, I hate Twitter. Anatol _Lieven, I think, or possibly it's Lieven _Anatol. ANATOL _LIEVEN. And I'm at Robert Writer, WRIGHTER, no underscore on Twitter. Thanks so much for taking the time, Anatol. I really encourage people to follow you throughout this probably unfortunate sequence of events we're about to see. Thank you so much. It's very kind of you.
Take care. Bye-bye.